Plato wrote about a civilization that vanished beneath the ocean roughly 9600 BC. He named it, described it in detail, and said his account came from Egyptian records. He was the only ancient writer to do so. That single fact has kept the argument alive for more than 2,000 years. The standard position is straightforward. Atlantis is a literary invention. Plato created it as a narrative device inside two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, to illustrate what happens when a society becomes corrupted by power and ambition. The city loses its moral foundation, overreaches, and is destroyed. That reading is not unreasonable. Plato used constructed examples throughout his work. The Republic itself describes an ideal city that never existed. So the argument goes, why should Atlantis be treated any differently? There is also the way Plato stages the story. He does not open with a god, a hero, or a vague age before memory. He gives the account a chain of people. Critias tells Socrates. Critias says he heard it from his grandfather. His grandfather heard it from Solon. Solon supposedly heard it in Egypt, from priests who claimed their records went back further than Greek memory. That does not make the chain reliable. A detailed source can still be invented. But it tells you what Plato wanted the reader to think they were hearing, not a campfire legend, not a symbolic myth floating outside time, but an old report that survived through families, travel, and written records. Why go to that trouble if the point was only to invent a warning about political corruption? The way he frames Atlantis is more historical than readers usually expect from a philosophical thought experiment. He gives it a specific date, a specific location, a specific chain of transmission, a story passed to the Athenian statesman Solon by an Egyptian priest, who presented it not as myth but as history preserved in Egyptian records. Plato puts considerable effort into making the account feel grounded. That framing has kept readers arguing over what Plato was trying to do with the story for more than 2,000 years. Here is what we know without any reference to Plato at all. The last ice age ended roughly 11,700 years ago. At its peak, around 20,000 to 21,000 years ago, sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. By the end of the glacial period, more than 120 meters of ocean rise had already begun to redraw the map of the world, a process that unfolded across thousands of years, with some of the fastest flooding occurring between roughly 15,000 and 6,000 years ago. What that means in practical terms is significant. Coastlines that humans lived on, farmed near, built near, coastlines that may have supported communities for generations, were progressively swallowed by rising water. Not overnight. Not in a single catastrophe. But steadily, and in some phases, rapidly enough that a single human lifetime would have witnessed dramatic, irreversible change. We have named some of these places. Doggerland was a landmass connecting Britain to continental Europe. It supported human populations. It is now beneath the North Sea. The Sunda Shelf connected much of what is now island Southeast Asia into a single continuous landmass. Beringia connected Asia and North America. These are not speculative. They are mapped, studied, and confirmed through seismic data, sediment cores, and radiocarbon dating. The question worth sitting with is not whether these places existed. They did. The question is what was on them, and how much of that record is now underwater and inaccessible. In 1994, workers digging in southeastern Turkey uncovered something that did not fit the existing model of human prehistory. What they found was Gobekli Tepe, a site containing large, elaborately carved stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures. The structures date to approximately the 10th and 9th millennia BC, making them among the oldest known monumental constructions on Earth. UNESCO has connected their construction to hunter-gatherer communities, which itself challenged long-held assumptions about what non-agricultural societies were capable of organizing and building. The standard assumption before sites like this came to light was relatively clean: agriculture came first, then settlement, then social complexity, then monumental construction. Gobekli Tepe does not follow that sequence. The people who built it were not, by the evidence we have, agricultural. And yet they coordinated the quarrying, transport, and carving of massive stone structures over an extended period. This does not prove that Atlantis existed. It does not prove that a lost civilization was responsible for anything at Gobekli Tepe. What it does is something more modest and more durable. It demonstrates that our models of what early human societies were capable of have been revised before, and may need to be revised again. The archaeological record from this period is incomplete. What survives tends to be stone. What was built from wood, reed, or other organic material near coastlines that are now submerged has, in almost all cases, not survived. This is where the honest version of the Atlantis question lives, not in claims about crystal technology or ancient astronauts, but in a straightforward problem of preservation and access. The coastlines where humans most likely concentrated during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene are, in large part, underwater. River deltas, estuaries, shallow coastal plains, these are the environments where early human populations tended to cluster. They offered fresh water, marine resources, and relatively stable conditions for settlement. And they are precisely the zones that were inundated as sea levels rose. Underwater archaeology exists and has produced real findings. Submerged sites have been identified off the coasts of India, the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and elsewhere. But the logistics are difficult, the costs are high, and the coverage is thin relative to the scale of what was potentially lost. We have surveyed a fraction of the relevant seafloor. What the rest contains is, for now, genuinely unknown. Writers like Graham Hancock have argued that this gap in the archaeological record is large enough to contain something significant, a sophisticated society, or network of societies, that has left almost no trace because its remains are sitting at depths we have barely begun to examine. That argument is not mainstream archaeology. It is not supported by direct evidence. But it is not, strictly speaking, falsified either, because falsifying it would require a level of underwater survey that does not yet exist. What mainstream archaeology does say is that complex human behavior is older than we once assumed, that the coastal record from the relevant period is genuinely incomplete, and that new findings continue to push back the timeline of organized human activity. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how incomplete evidence works. So where does that leave us? Plato wrote a story. He framed it carefully, gave it specific geography, a specific date, and a specific chain of transmission. Whether that framing reflects a genuine historical source, a dimly remembered cultural memory of coastal flooding, or a carefully constructed literary device designed to feel historical, we do not know. Scholars have argued all three positions seriously, and none of them has been able to close the case. What we do know is that the world Plato was describing, a world of coastlines and civilizations before a dramatic transformation, is not as implausible a setting as it once seemed. People were living on land that is now underwater. They were building structures more complex than early models predicted. The period he points to is genuinely one of rapid environmental change, and the archaeological record from that period is genuinely thin in the places it matters most. That does not make Atlantis real. It does not confirm that any specific lost civilization existed in any specific location. What it means is that the question of what human societies were doing in the coastal zones of the late Ice Age, and what trace they left behind, is a real archaeological question, one that remains open not because of myth, but because of geography, ocean depth, and the limits of what we have so far been able to reach. Plato may have invented it entirely. Or he may have been pointing, however imperfectly, at something that happened. The honest answer is that we do not yet have the tools to know for certain.